welcome to the IISS this afternoon, and to the first of what I hope will be a series of events on the defence and military implications of climate change. In the Institute, we're already seeing that climate change is having an impact on human security and conflict. For example, it's very visible to our people working on the Armed Conflict Survey in the case of the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. And the recent US National Intelligence Agency report highlighted this as a global challenge. It's likely to increase the demand on the military for humanitarian and disaster relief operations, as well as stabilization operations. And one thing that's very clear from the Paris Agreement is that governments should be acting to reduce the threat from climate change, and they certainly shouldn't be making things worse. Well, with their large numbers of land, sea, and air vehicles, armed forces at the moment consume large numbers of hydrocarbon fuels and produce quite a few greenhouse gas emissions. So quite clearly, armed forces are going to have to adapt both to operating in a world that's been changed by climate change, but also to reduce their emissions so as to not make climate change worse. Now, the UK has been at the forefront of government level adjustment to this and is one of the countries that has passed legislation for a national net zero target. And over the last year, the UK Ministry of Defence has been working on a strategy for it and the armed forces to adapt to this climate changed era. The person who's leading it has been Lieutenant General Richard Nugee. And I'm pleased to say that ISS has played a small part in helping him with his work. He's just leaving the army now, but he's had a long and varied military career with lots of operational service across the breadth and depth of his career and also the British Army's role. And he's going to speak for about half an hour to explain the findings of the work he's done, which was launched by the British government last month. After that, there'll be a Q&A and a discussion session. Yes, and there we have the window. What we'd prefer is if you use the Q&A button to type out your questions. But if you feel very, very exercised on wanting to ask the question in person, you're welcome to raise your hand. And with that, I'll hand over to Lieutenant General Nugee. Welcome, General.
Ben, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for the opportunity to speak. It's precipitate that tomorrow, President Biden has his climate summit. And one of the areas that is being discussed is climate and security, being led by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. And it is particularly, I think, pleasing that our Secretary of State for Defense, Ben Wallace, has been invited to talk about the UK lead on climate and security. And this is part of a wider space in terms of moving towards perhaps COP26, but definitely towards environments like the Munich Security Conference, where climate and security is becoming much more prominent in what it means and what we should do about it. And I will cover that very briefly. Let me share my my slides. So just to give you a feel for where we're going and what I found, if you like, on my report. So I produced the report just for Christmas, actually, for the Defence Board and for the Executive Committee of Defence. And it was very well received. And it was well received, I think, partly because it was a report. What I tried to do was not only a review and a strategy and a plan, which had some facts and figures in it, which stayed with the Defence Board, but also I spent a lot of time trying to argue, why is this relevant to defence? What is it that defence has as a part to play in both climate change and security, and also the sustainability? And I think that's important because there is a mood out there, and certainly when I started writing the report about a year ago, just over a year ago, there was a mood which turns around and says this is nothing to do with defence. Defence should concentrate on protecting its citizens. Our citizens will get a we'll get some sort of exemption from all of the climate change rules that are coming out of the rest of government. This is not for us. And so what I really wanted to do was persuade people that two things. One is this is definitely for us, and two, that actually, regardless of whether we like it or not, something is happening around us, and the environment in which we are operating and would have to fight is changing, and we need to pay attention to that just as much as the environment of the electromagnetic spectrum with cyber and so on is changing. The environment in space is changing. We need to understand what is happening around us and do something about it. So this isn't something that we could just ignore. And when people talked about exemptions, I sort of came with a quip that said, you can't exempt yourself from the world. The world is changing. The facts are there. The science is absolutely dominant now, and people are believing the science now. And so we need to understand, as the best we should in defense, understand the environment we're operating in and do something about it. I characterized it as in two spaces. One is, what is the effect of climate change on defense? And the second is, what is the effect of defense on climate change? And they're two sides of the same coin, and of course they're linked, but actually there are very different outcomes. And it's the difference between mitigation and resilience and adaptation in the sort of more traditional climate change language. But actually I haven't used that language deliberately because it's not the language of the military. And what my report has tried to do is show that actually this is something not only that the military must do, but that the military can do and can take advantage from. This is about opportunity. This is about understanding the changing dynamics of threat and risk and taking opportunity from it. And I remember being taught at Sandhurst that if you don't have the initiative, you do something to regain or gain the initiative. And that is exactly the same in this environment. Actually, what we're trying to do is gain the initiative in this climate changing world, and therefore take opportunity where it comes. And I hope that that will come across in what I have to say. So I came with three primary defense ambitions. The first, to act and be recognized as a global leader in effectively the emerging threats of climate and security, or as I'm beginning to start to call it, climate and stability. Because stability implies security and is less threatening to those who worry about the securitization of climate. And by that, I think what is meant is that some militaries in some parts of the world would see this as an opportunity to impose their will if they're given too much latitude. And I think we need to be careful of people's sensitivities on that. But the reality is that climate is creating more pressure on certain countries and on certain environments. The Sahel, the predictions are that by 2035, 2040, the base temperature of the Sahel will be an environment which humans have never lived in. It is just too hot. And the effect of that is going to be not only a diminishing food resource, which will bring its own problems, but also a migration on the straight fact that it's too hot to live. And therefore, you're going to get migration. And the worst figures I have seen suggest that there could be 200 million people migrating from the Sahel. Now, of course, not all of them are going to come to Europe. But where there is migration, all our history tells us there's certainly an increased chance of conflict, because those being dispossessed by the environment in which they're moving from are more likely to move into an environment where there are already people. And by doubling or by increasing the population, you are going to have an environment whereby people come into conflict with other people. The threat of this is that actually those environments where there are dispossessed people, where there is conflict, leads to two outcomes. One outcome is increased radicalization. And we see in Somalia, there's a really good example. The UN have deployed their first ever climate security ambassador to Somalia. And what he has assessed, he's a soldier, and what he has assessed is that actually what's happening is that because of climate change and the threat to water, the crops that are outside the cities are failing. So people are moving into the cities to try and find some sort of income, and that al-Shabaab are picking them up as dispossessed persons. The ISIS did exactly the same in Iraq, and are using them and offering them something which they don't have anymore, all because of the threats and the lack of food in the rural environments. So what this climate and security ambassador is doing in order to counter the threat of al-Shabaab in this particular case, what he's doing is he is increasing the irrigation by investing to a certain extent in development, increasing the irrigation, which increases the food, which stops people migrating into the cities, which stops the recruits becoming easy for al-Shabaab. The proof of that, in a sense, is that al-Shabaab have now started to attack the irrigation channels because they understand what is going on. So there's a very, very specific example of how climate change is threatening through migration and threatening conflict. So that's one answer. The other, or one issue. The other issue is, of course, migration into an environment which is already relatively full of people leads to greater migration. So you get the migration away from North Africa into Europe, away from Syria, for all sorts of reasons, into Europe. And just a little bit of migration, let's call it 1 to 2 million, has caused major disruptions in Europe. How much more would it be if you got significant migration from Africa into Europe? Now, I'm not suggesting that that's going to happen, but we need to be alive to that. And we need to be alive to the fact that countries in conflict also will not be concentrating on trying to reduce their emissions and add to the opportunity to get to net zero across the world. So you've got the double whammy of not only have you got increased threat, and you've got a potential for increased radicalization, and actually, if militaries operate, they increase their emissions. You've also got the distraction for a country or for a state, or for an environment that is not looking to try and reduce. And therefore, you've got a double whammy. We need to be alive to that. We need to understand that. We need to understand what we can do about it. And of course, the other side of these threats is, as Ben mentioned at the beginning, the chances are that you're going to have greater humanitarian assistance requirements, you're going to have greater disaster relief requirements abroad, and RAND have done some very good studies on that, as well as actually at home, and military assistance to civil authorities might become a bigger part of what we do with floods and so on, and wildfires potentially in this country, but certainly floods more likely. That's one side of the argument. And so that's why I argue that we should act and be recognized as a global leader. We are, after all, a member of the P5. The second is to be able to adapt and be able to fight and win in ever more hostile and unforgiving physical environments. So the world's changing around us. It is becoming more hostile, more unforgiving, but it's also offering opportunities. So the melting of the Arctic ice in the summer, in perhaps 20 years' time, 15 to 20 years' time, is something that we can't just ignore. There will be opportunities there for our adversaries potentially, our allies potentially, to operate in a space that we need to be able to operate in as well. But between the summer, when it's free-flowing water, and the winter, when it's gone back to pack ice, there will be a period of what the Canadians call disruptive ice. And to operate in disruptive ice, you need slightly hardened shells, if you like, hardened hulls of your ships. And so we need to think about that and work out what is it that we need to do to our ships. I would suggest ships coming that we're building now, as opposed to ships that we have already. What is it we need to do for our ships to be able to make sure that they can operate in not only the open water in the summer, but the disruptive ice between summer and winter, that actually others, the Russians have already started hardening some of their hulls and have one ship that's already got a hardened hull specifically for this sort of environment. We need to understand what it is that we need to do so that we don't just lose our freedom of maneuver. And that freedom of maneuver is something that is just as relevant in the Arctic as it is in the Gulf, where actually the surface sea temperature is predicted to be up to perhaps 40 degrees by 2035, 2040, which means that our ships that rely on cold water to cool their engines are going to be unable to do so. And therefore, we need to understand what is it that we need to do to our engines of the future to be able to operate in an environment where the sea surface temperature is so hot that it's acting as a thermal blanket rather than cooling our engines. But there's a third piece here as well, which is about reducing our emissions. So whereas the first two are what is the effect of climate change on defense, defense has an effect on climate change. We're 50% of central government emissions. If you take the Pentagon, the piece I've read is if you took the Pentagon as an independent country, its emissions would be the equivalent of Denmark as a country. And therefore, this is not trivial stuff. If you include our supply chain and what's called scope 3 emissions, we're 3% of UK's, us in the defense industry are 3% of UK's emissions. So to ignore that and say it doesn't affect defense seems to me to be wrong in principle, wrong in practice, wrong morally, but also will arguably be against the law because we have a legal obligation to get to net zero by 2050. So I would argue that we have to, as a department, support the UK legal commitment to reach net zero by 2050. And if that all sounds negative, I refuse to believe that this is a zero-sum game. I refuse to believe it's either looking at climate change or being operationally effective. I believe it's both. Not only do we have to adapt to a climate change world, as I've talked about, but actually it offers us opportunities. Self-sufficient deployments where we're more resilient, where we're less reliant on our supply chains and our logistic trains is really, really useful. And if you take two statistics, and they're both very sad statistics. The US believe 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers were killed on logistic resupply patrols. For the UK, our most senior officer killed in Afghanistan was killed on a logistic supply patrol. And importantly, that officer was an infantryman. And that says something about how we had to protect our logistic supply patrols through infantry in order to get them through, and actually with helicopters overhead. Now, if you reduced the logistic supply because you've become more self-sufficient in energy through solar panels, through other forms of energy, through hydrogen, you've potentially reduced the requirement for water through recycling water and cleaning water in a much more sophisticated way, of potentially food, although I think that's a technology that is still yet to come, where you can have what's called vertical farming, then actually we would reduce our logistic supply trains, we'd be releasing infantry, we'd be reducing loss of life. All of that is about improved operational advantage. Smaller and uncrewed platforms, what are we looking at? We're looking at the potential for taking the person out of the equipment. If you do that, and the top right photo is of the trials that we're doing for mine hunters with the French. If you do that, it makes the equipment smaller by taking the person out of it. You can go from a 70-ton tank to the Army's looking at 25-ton tanks, which are uncrewed, don't have people in them. What that offers is opportunity for renewable energy sources. You cannot provide renewable energy for a 70-ton tank with all the characteristics that a tank needs, 300 kilometers range, refueling in 7 minutes or whatever the figure is today. You can't do that with renewable energy easily or perhaps even at all. So by reducing the size, by reducing the weight, by increasing the sort of the power to weight ratio, you bring it into the realm of renewable energy. That offers opportunity. Smaller, more for the same amount of money, recharge some, put some out. Let's say 10 little mine hunters with a mothership, 5 out at any one time, greater range than just one mine hunter and 5 being recharged at any one time. Potential there. Electric, quieter and stealthier propulsion. The hybrid Jackal is a great example of an army vehicle that has the ability to run on battery. Why is that important? It reduces emissions from its exhaust pipes. It reduces heat emissions. It reduces noise emissions. It makes it a better vehicle for sneaking about the battlefield. That's the sort of operational advantage we have. And we could do 3D printing as opposed to putting spare parts onto logistic supply trains. And we can use AI-enabled planning. So there are great opportunities for endurance, for resilience, and for actually improving our operational capability through embracing the ideas that climate change is forcing on us. And I see that as a huge positive. But also, I think we have a duty. We are responsible for or own and train over 2% of the UK's landmass. We also have about 100,000 buildings, give or take, and 440,000 hectares, and we're the 7th largest home owner in the country. So all of the stuff about what's called space heat, so heating our buildings and so on, all of that it affects us as much as it affects other parts of government and other parts of our built estate across the country. We need to try and think about reducing the demand for electricity, increasing our efficiency and moving away from fossil fuels, so that actually what we're doing is building potentially hydrogen, potentially micronuclear, potentially solar panels, and we're certainly putting solar panels up. And the advantage of that is twofold. One is resilience. It is predicted, and I haven't seen the latest figures, but if the whole country moved overnight into electric cars, we would not have enough electricity in this country to be able to run them all. And therefore, what you end up with is the potential for blackouts. Now, I don't think that'll happen in this country, but actually there's the potential there. So if you build your own energy source, for the first time in centuries, we're able to use our own energy source in a modern way, then that builds resilience for our bases. But also, it'll keep the costs down, because these are spend to save measures. Whereas I can guarantee that the cost of electricity will go up in this country consistently over the next decades. We can use the rural estate as long as we keep it for training, but we can use the rural estate to increase the amount of carbon that we can store. And we've just done a natural audit, a natural estate audit of natural capital audit, sorry, of how much carbon we can sequester on an annual basis through trees, through grasses, through boglands, through regenerating some of the peatlands up in Otterburn and places like that. And the answer is about 1.2 million tons. So if we get our estate into really good condition, then we can start to sequester carbon. And we can look for the best possible sites for emission-free energy generation. So we shouldn't be disposing of our estate willy-nilly. We should be looking at areas where we can build some of the opportunities. And what you've got in the bottom right-hand corner, that's not actually RAF Marham. What that is an anaerobic digester, which is right next door to RAF Marham, that gives RAF Marham 60% of its energy, 60% of its electricity. And it's done through fields around that digester, and harvesting the gas that comes off that anaerobic digesting. So as long as we maintain our primary purpose, actually we can increase biodiversity, we can increase carbon capture, we can increase value of the environment. And some of this is reversing what we've done over the last 30 years. So we've been draining Senny Bridge training area for the last 30 years. What we should be doing is not draining it, but allowing some more wetlands to come in. It'll make it slightly more difficult for the infantry. That's probably not a bad thing in some respects. But actually what it'll allow is a different type of biodiversity and increased opportunity for sequester, because wetlands sequester carbon far better than just drylands. And we will plant some more trees. We need to cut down a lot of trees that were designed for fighting on the West German plain in the 1970s and 1980s. They're still there, and design our training areas for a fight in the 21st century. But that can also include increasing trees. We need to build more sustainable equipment. not only in terms of trying to reduce the emissions from our equipment and capture some of the carbon in our emissions. So the new patrol class, or I think they're all given river names, but the offshore patrol vessels that the Navy's got, they're capturing, when they've got the capability, they're capturing something like 98% of the carbon that comes out of their funnels through using things like AdBlue and so on. So we need to configure, but what we need to do is make sure that industry is helping us on this. And industry needs to help us in a way that actually, from source, so to speak, from the requirement setting all the way through the design, what we're trying to do is minimize the amount of emissions. And one idea is to try and build a commercial construct which turns around and says, not only will the procurer say that we need to do this, but the commercial contract will force a industry and encourage industry to try. It's turning around and saying, we won't even enter a bid, or won't allow a bid to enter one of our competitions unless the company that is doing the bidding has a route to net zero itself. Our scope 3 emissions are huge. That's the emissions from our supply chain, are huge. They're something in the region of 9 to 10 million tons of CO2 and other noxious gases, greenhouse gases. There's no way that we can offset all that. So we have to make sure that the defense industry is encouraged as much as possible to reduce their own emissions so that our scope 3 come down. And so we must use the power of government to be able to do that by saying, we won't enter into a contract with you unless you have an ability to get your emissions down, and unless actually you're helping us get our emissions down. We have to adapt our equipment to make sure that it's fit for the 21st century. And what I'm really talking about is new equipment. I was told that we replace about 25% of our equipment every decade. So in the next 3 decades, by 2050, we will replace arguably 75% of our equipment. All of that 75%, when it's replaced, should be cognizant of the carbon that they're producing and the emissions that they're producing, and try and minimize them in the design stage, because it's both a hell of a lot cheaper, but it's also easier. But this causes huge problems for industry, because what I'm saying to industry is, in the new frigate, for example, the last thing that you should be designing is the propulsion system and the energy system within that frigate, because actually the technology is moving on so fast that it would be wrong to design that as the first thing. It's a bit like, for those who remember it, the battlefield artillery target engagement system, where the first thing they designed was the box to put the computer in. And the last thing they designed was the software 10 years later, by which time the box and the equipment and the 286 processor was so outmatched that it never worked. So there's a piece here about that bit of technology which is developing the fastest, which at the moment is in the green energy space, must be the last to be developed. And the last to be stipulated in terms of how you're going to get to the requirement that can be set right at the beginning. So this requires a different thinking, it requires a different partnership and a different collaboration with industry. And I put there fast follower strategy. It should not be the defense budget that is designing the fuel system for commercial aircraft, or for the maritime fleets of the world that are putting container ships all around the world. It shouldn't be up to the MOD budget. And in fact, the maritime industry are spending something like £16 billion on trying to work out what is the best fuel for sending container ships around the world. It shouldn't be the defense budget that's doing that. But the moment that a decision is taken that is going to be universally accepted, then we need to jump on that and use that in our equipments as well. And that's what I mean by fast follower. The Secretary of State calls it early adoption. So how, in my last minute or two, how do we get to the government's 2050 target? How do we contribute? We minimize our emissions as much as possible by moving to renewable energy sources. And it's not just on the estate, which is where this has traditionally gone. But you can see that grey bottom patch, that's our military capability, and that's come down from 2 million tonnes to about 1.2 million tonnes through using different fuels. So the RAF signing up to a protocol which allows 50% sustainable aviation fuels by 2040, and they've told me privately, but they won't declare it, that actually we may be at 100% by then, sustainable aviation fuels. So there's an opportunity here to take a different source of fuel for our military aviation. There's potential for different fuel sources, renewable fuel sources for our vehicles. And I am sure that by 2050, the maritime industry will have come up with some sort of solution as to how to reduce its emissions. But as you can see, we're not trying to get to zero. This is net zero because that dotted red line is about sequester. We use the rural estate, we bring the rural estate back to what it's optimized for in terms of the environment, bearing in mind that it's used for training. So what we don't want is, for example, the whole of Salisbury Plain to be covered in trees. That's no good for training. What we need to do is do it judiciously, do it sensibly, try and get our tenant farmers. A third of our rural estate is tenant farmed as the sort of edges of our training areas. Try and get them to be much more environmentally aware and try and reduce their emissions as farmers. How are we going to do it? The concept is to have carbon accounting where we have a budget, if you like, or an allowance of carbon. It's very similar to the carbon budgets that's been in the news just recently and the 78% reduction by 2035 that the government's just declared. That's based on a series of carbon budgets. We're at carbon budget 6 at the moment. Use the similar principles of actually giving a budget to defence. This is how much carbon you can effectively emit over the next few years and have a reducing amount of carbon over the next 30 years, and giving TLBs, top level budget holders, the commands, the Army, Navy, Air Force and Strategic Command and DE&S and all the rest of it, giving them the opportunity to work out how they're going to get to their allowance. That is a much better way of working in a delegated model than telling them what to do. Just tell them that's your target. How you do it is up to you. But also embracing the circular economy, also understanding the whole life cost of projects, both in terms of finance and in terms of carbon. It's really important. And we've put a campaign, a putative campaign plan out. It's really a set of milestones of what would success look like in the next 30 years. But it would be foolish of me to write a plan for 30 years. The plan goes for 5 years with 1-year targets and 5-year targets. It'd be foolish to go 30 years. How many plans are we still operating on from 1991? I would hope the answer is 0. And therefore, what we should be doing is understanding that the world is going to change very dramatically in the next 20 to 30 years. So let's have a plan for the first few and then try and move forward from there. Ben, I will stop there. And hopefully stop sharing as well, if I can. Very happy to answer any questions.
Well, thanks, General. We've got some questions on the Q&A already, and I'll begin with Shiloh Fetzek's question. For those of you who don't know her, she is an expert on climate change and security in her own right, and she's an associate fellow of the IISS. Shiloh asked that you mentioned there was some resistance initially to the agenda within defence, and I imagine not everybody has been won over yet. What can the climate security research community do to make this case culturally almost that this level of commitment and action is needed and is essential both for global stability and military effectiveness?
So I think where I've come from and where I think it is really important to continue to press is to show that the traditional military requirement, whether it is a requirement to be able to operate anywhere in the world at any point in time, the requirement to build resilience in countries that are either fragile or particularly affected by climate change, the requirement to understand the geopolitical consequences. I think one of the biggest issues we've got is the geopolitical consequences that will come out of moving away from fossil fuels, because those countries that rely on fossil fuels exports for their income are going to be affected. There are going to be winners and losers. Those countries, similarly, such as Greenland, suddenly coming up on the horizon as a source of rare earths. This is going to change the geopolitical map. This is traditional defense stuff. This is traditional security stuff, but in a world where actually climate change is making that effect. And what we need to do is talk in the language that defense, that those in the security environment understand. It is important, I think. I did not once talk about the moral argument. There is, of course, a moral argument. There is, of course, the sort of the effect that we're leaving the generations in the future if we don't do anything about it. But that's not going to win in the boardrooms of security apparatus or defense against whether we need a new radar for an F-35 or something. So we've got to make it relevant to the audience you're talking about, and in this case, it's relevant to the security audience and relevant to the military audience. That's how we win people across. Go on their territory. Don't try and say that this is all about greening the military. This is not. This is about making sure that we are more secure.
Well, thanks for that, General. If I can turn to a question on the Q&A from William Schneider. He asked about the weaponization of climate change. And the example he uses is the deglaciation of the Tibetan Plateau, the source of water for the largest rivers in South and Southeast Asia, which he tells us is being manipulated by China through hydroelectric dams. And he also says that during its dispute with Vietnam over the South China Sea, China sharply reduced the flow of water to Vietnam's Mekong River. And the question he asked is how security alliances, for example, NATO, the Quadrilateral Dialogue, etc., can test this emerging threat. And I know that you have been having conversations with NATO about the implications of climate change.
So I think there's it's interesting. When my piece was launched, there was a comment on Twitter. I think it was probably on Twitter, where somebody just turned around and said, "There's no evidence whatsoever that climate change," and the quoted examples were from 10 to 15 years ago. There's no example whatsoever of climate change affecting security. And I don't know 10 to 15 years ago whether those studies were right at the time, but I can absolutely guarantee that they're not going to be right in the future, and that we should be looking forwards rather than looking backwards. So the first thing, and NATO is really keen on this, and this is an area that we're trying to develop. The first thing we need to do is understand where is it that those potential conflicts are going to take place. You've got, for example, the dam in Ethiopia, which is worrying Sudan and the Nile, and Egypt through control of water in the Nile. But what's interesting about it is that at the face value, the Ethiopians could control the water, which could control the ability of Egypt and Sudan to grow food through irrigation. But what's interesting is already climate change experts are beginning to turn around and say, but if you combine that with solar power, you can have all the energy you need, Ethiopia, and you can still allow enough water to go down the environment, down the Nile, to be able to support Sudan and Egypt. And so there's a piece here about understanding, and from understanding, looking for alternatives that will allow an opportunity for energy as well as for water to be used for irrigation and so on to continue in those environments. But there's a really important point, which is that climate change will, I would have thought, be used as an excuse for various security problems. So we already have seen one tanker in Somalia, or off the coast of Somalia, I should say, not in Somalia, off the coast of Somalia, that was ransomed, and the threat was, we will contaminate the water by letting open the stopcocks on this oil tanker if you don't give us the pay that we want. So it's become a weapon already. What we need to do is understand that and find ways around, if possible, allowing that conflict to develop. Partly by talking, partly by providing alternatives, so that there's no legitimate reason for conflict to happen. There'll always be, though, reasons why people want to go to war or want to have an influence, and we need to be alive to it and try and persuade them not to. there was an article. Sorry, I always talk far too long. But there's an article written in America about a year ago whose title was "Should we invade Brazil to save the rainforest?" The very fact that article was written. Now, the answer was no, we shouldn't. We should use every available means short of military intervention in order to be able to save the rainforest. But I wonder in 20 years' time whether the answer will be the same if we haven't adapted. So I think that people will use opportunities to create what they want in terms of influence and conflict. It's just climate change is another one. We need to do everything we can to stop that.
General, there's a couple of follow-on questions here, which I'd group together. One from Dimitrios Katamnidis, forgive me if I've not pronounced it right. And they ask, except for climate change, are there any other important environmental issues that concern the security community? And the second one from Dinant Natan Negara is there a specific focus, including partnership, the UK's new strategy is given to the Commonwealth? And while you're just thinking on how you tackle that, I wonder if I could add a couple of observations. On the Commonwealth, I don't know what the answer to the question is, but I would commend to you two excellent papers that are on the website of the New Zealand Defence Force. One of them is their climate adaptation strategy, but the other one is a climate risk security assessment for the whole of the Southwest Pacific, which is New Zealand's area of strategic interest. And that's certainly relevant to a number of Commonwealth states that are vulnerable to climate change. Over to you, General.
So I think the climate change is for me, and this is just laziness in my part, but climate change is a shorthand for environment, for biodiversity, and so on. And one of the things I'm fortunate enough to be is a patron of an expedition going to the Antarctic this winter. Northern European winter, so the austral summer, to look at the effect of microplastics on the Antarctic and taking ice cores of microplastics in the Antarctic. Now, I would put that under the umbrella of climate change. Of course, it's not climate change. It's all about environment. It's all about pollution. It's all about the damage that we're doing through the concept of microplastics. But it's a similar sort of awareness and waking up to the fact that we're damaging the world that we're living on. Climate change is a very obvious example of that. The damage to the environment and the loss of biodiversity is a very obvious example of that. And I think that what the UK needs to do, and certainly the military must play its part, and defence must play its part, is to try and slow down the loss of biodiversity and hopefully reverse it, and to increase the environmental conditions of our estate. We can only do what we have the ability to influence. And similarly, the Royal Navy is, and I'm just really pleased about this. They are responsible for 4.2 million square kilometres of marine environment, protected environment, and they're now looking about putting ships to actually patrol those marine environments in order to try and make sure that there isn't this sort of scraping off the bottom of trawlers and so on. So there's opportunity there, which is more than just looking at the security implications of climate change. In terms of the Commonwealth, absolutely, we intend to talk to the Commonwealth, and I'm talking to people about trying to get the Commonwealth in the same space. NATO are very much already in the same space as we are, and Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, has already put a number of papers out and has made it part of NATO 30, their new strategy. That actually there's a really important part, one of the 6 key parts of that NATO strategy, is climate change, and what are we going to do about it? So I think there's a growing acceptance that this is something that militaries ought to be involved in, if only at its really basis is to reduce our own emissions.
Okay, we've got some interesting questions building up on the Q&A, but there's someone called Ariane who's very patiently raised their hand. I want to see if I can get them to put their question in person. Can we do that, tech support? Okay, well, we seem to have drawn a blank. No, we seem to have drawn a blank on that. I'll come back to the Q&A. And there was really quite an interesting question about working with the private sector from someone called Rob Jerd. And he asked how much the MOD can do that for engineering and scientific resources, developing new technologies around mobility, renewable energy, or other areas. Or will it solely be within the remit of ARIA, a term in capitals I don't recall? But I think Rob's drift is clear enough. And it does relate to something you mentioned earlier, General, is whether in some areas defence is going to need to go beyond the fast follower approach.
So yes, absolutely, defence must go beyond the fast follower approach for those areas where defence is specific. I mean, I see in some respects, I'm a very simple soldier. We have developed technology that puts us at the forefront of the technological cutting edge, if you like, throughout our history. And often technologies, particularly in wartime, technologies have been developed on the back of what the military require. I see this as absolutely no different. Technology needs to be harnessed. New technology needs to be embraced. We need to move with the technological revolutions that are happening. And there are, I would argue, a number of technological revolutions happening at the moment. And I won't go through all of them by any manner of means. But what is really clear is that there is a revolution in energy. And for the first time in 100 and something years, we have the ability to create our own energy. We also have a real difficulty because really for the last 100 years, there's been one source of energy, particularly for vehicles and for equipment in the military, whether it's ships, aircraft or on land, and that is oil-based energy. So whether it's aviation fuel or whether it is diesel in our tanks, that's changing. The type of fuel that you use in an aircraft is unlikely to be the type of fuel you use for an armored vehicle, which is unlikely to be the type of fuel that you use in a ship. We're going from a sort of a mono sphere of one type of fuel, different variants of it, to fundamentally different types of fuel, and a fundamentally different type of fuel again for running our bases. Solar panels. You can't put solar panels on an F-35, but you can put solar panels on the hangar that has the F-35 inside it, which will provide the energy for that base. So we're talking about a diversity of fuels, and that's what the energy revolution is about. We must be at the forefront of that, but we must be literally cutting edge and use our own R&D for those areas which are specific to the military. But we shouldn't be using our own R&D necessarily for those areas which the rest of the world are going to develop anyway, because we only have limited funds and they must be used for military advantage. But as far as a private partnership is concerned, absolutely we should be going with a private partnership, a partnership with the private industry and with private companies, because that's where a lot of the innovation is coming from.
Well, thank you for that. There's a specific question on synthetic aircraft fuels from Sam Sears. And he asked, does the UK need to be able to produce synthetic aircraft fuels independently? And should it be the MOD's responsibility to do this?
So I'm sure we could produce some, but I don't think, do we produce the oil that we use today, or the oil base that we use today in our aviation fuels? Do we produce all the oil that we need for all our ships and our vehicles today, or do we import it? At the moment, I would argue that we import an awful lot of it, not least because North Sea oil A is running out, but B is of a different material type that we need for aviation fuel, and therefore, actually, the reality is it should be no different. We should be importing sustainable aviation fuel if that is where we need to. Of course, we could produce some of our own, but we would probably go for importing quite a lot of it anyway. So should the MOD do it? No, I don't think so. The MOD doesn't have its own oil refineries. The MOD doesn't have its own oil fields at the moment. So why should that be any different? But what we should be doing is building resilience where it is obvious that that is possible. And that resilience might might be micronuclear, might be solar panels, it might be hydro, it might be wind farms. If we've got it on our land and we could use it effectively, then why wouldn't we? So there may be the opportunity to create our own sustainable aviation fuel, but I wouldn't have thought that that would be a priority.
Thanks, General. Would you mind saying a couple of words about the whole business of micronuclear powered generation? ISS, of course, does do a lot of work on nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, and the whole ecology that supports that, including the need for nuclear security. And I know that in many many parts of the world, that there's a considerable intake of breath when people mention the possibility of more nuclear reactors. Could you just take us through their potential value?
So micronuclear, I mean, it was very interesting. Yesterday, Baroness Brown, who is the vice president, I think, of or vice chair of the Committee on Climate Change, was asked directly a question on Radio 4 as to whether the ideas for energy included nuclear, and she said yes. She couldn't see any reason why not. My perception of this, and I'm not an expert, of course, I'm not an expert on nuclear, but my perception of this is this depends to a certain extent on price, and actually she said the same. If micronuclear is a cheap way of developing consistent energy, and consistent energy at a high level, then why wouldn't we go for it, as long as all the safeguards around nuclear are properly understood? And I absolutely understand the worries that people have about nuclear, but micronuclear is something that various companies are trying to develop, which is both small and extremely efficient, and has the ability to understand how to dispose of it at the end of its life. If it's really, really expensive, and I don't think a micronuclear plant has been built yet that is a sort of a run-of-the-mill as opposed to a prototype, then actually it probably isn't the best answer. So I think it depends on price. It depends on having that ability to dispose of the nuclear in a way that is sensible and is safe, and use as much recycling as you possibly can within that nuclear. But it ought to certainly be looked at as an option. I think one of the things I would say is we don't know genuinely in 2021 what the energy requirements and the energy supply is going to be in 2040, 2050. Micronuclear should be an absolute part of the equation in terms of looking at what is the most effective way of producing enough electricity and enough energy for us to run our country and to run our bases in the defense world as efficiently as possible. To disregard it now, I think, is wrong, but that doesn't mean to say we definitely go with it, because it'll depend on price and its ability to be recycled.
Thanks, General. I'd like to ask you one more question. When you did all this work, of course, you were working off the then UK goal of cutting emissions compared with the 1990 level by 68% by 2030. But helpfully, the Prime Minister yesterday increased the ambition and announced that the UK will cut its emissions by an extra 10% to 78% compared with 1990 by 2035. Does that have any impact on the proposals you've made to the Ministry of Defence?
So in terms of exactly what we need to do, no, because the proposals, as I said earlier, my proposals took us to 5 years rather than to 2030 anyway. So in terms of the detail, no, but I think it is really, really important. It's important because it brings to life the real difficulty of delivering this. This is going to affect people's lives. It makes it, in a sense, far more central to people's priorities. That if this has become a legal requirement, effectively, then actually the reality is it is going to affect people's lives. Government hasn't worked out quite how to do that yet, that it affects people's lives as little as possible, but it is going to affect people's lives. That, in a sense, makes my argument just as strong, if not stronger, that defence needs to play its part. the defence needs to get its house in order to be able to contribute to the 78% by 2035 and, of course, the 100% by 2050. We need to play our part, and we need to do as much as we possibly can. It makes my call for action all the stronger.
Well, thank you very much. I think actually that's probably a good place to stop. And I know that you've got another appointment to go to dead on 3:30. But I don't think you could have summarized it much better. So I won't attempt to. But just to say that this is an issue that concerns the IISS. And in our conflict security and development program, we do have experts watching these conflicts that we think are being affected by climate change. And our work certainly would endorse the conclusions that you mentioned the UN ambassador had drawn about Somalia. And we'll look forward to see what the ISS Armed Conflict Survey, published within the next few months, will say about the impact of climate change on the global armed conflicts. And can I, on behalf of the Institute and all those from outside the Institute that have joined us, thank you very much, and also commend to the audience 2 particular documents. One which General Nugee commissioned, A Changing Climate, which was a report by RAND and the University of Exeter, which was part of this, and that can be found on the RAND website. And then his own report on defence, climate change and sustainability adaptation, which is very easy to find on the Ministry of Defence's website. And can I wish you best of luck in your future work on this, General. Thanks very much for giving such an excellent talk and such a helpful response to all the questions. Thanks very much.
Ben, thank you. And also thank you to the IISS actually for helping me, because the seminars that you ran were really significantly helpful to trying to get the right answer for this, for defence and actually for the country. So thank you very much indeed.
You're too kind, General. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.